The storm had been brewing for 3 cycles now, and every species with half a survival instinct had already sealed themselves in their atmospheric bunkers. The Keltar, the Viridian Collective, even the stubborn Threxian miners, all had retreated to their climate-controlled sanctuaries deep beneath the surface of Outpost Theta 7. All except one. Miradon stood at the edge of the settlement, her weathered hands gripping a plasma welder as she reinforced the last panel of the shelter. The wind howled around her, carrying crystalline sand that could flay exposed skin in minutes. Her environment suit's alarms screamed warnings she'd long since muted. Behind her, huddled in the half-finished structure, 17 pairs of luminescent eyes watched her every movement. The Linari cubs. They weren't supposed to be here. Their migration route should have taken them south, away from the pole where Theta 7 sat like a defiant thumb against the planet's hostile atmosphere. But something had gone wrong. Climate shift, magnetic interference, or simple bad luck. And the cubs had arrived just as the storm warnings began. The adult Linari had made their choice quickly. They were a practical species, evolved for survival above sentiment. The cubs were too young, too slow. They would be a liability in the race to shelter, so the adults had left them, as their instincts demanded, trusting that the strong would survive and the weak would return to the earth. They hadn't accounted for Miradon. "Just a few more minutes," she muttered, her breath fogging the inside of her helmet. The shelter was crude, corrugated Durasteel panels bent into a dome, energy shields jury-rigged from mining equipment, life support borrowed from decommissioned shuttle parts. It wouldn't win any engineering awards, but it would hold. It had to. Saren, the smallest of the cubs, pressed his face against the transparent aluminum of the incomplete wall, his silver fur rippling with bioluminescent anxiety. His species communicated through light patterns, and right now his entire body flickered with the same question. Why? Why was this human risking her life for creatures she had no biological imperative to protect? The Linari weren't even part of the galactic union that Mira's people had only recently joined. They were classified as semi-sentient, somewhere between animal and person in the eyes of most species. Useful for labor when trained, but ultimately disposable. Mira had overheard the conversation at the command center 3 days ago. Commander Vexthor, a Kael'tar with all the warmth of a neutron star, had been explicit. "The Linari cubs are not our responsibility. We have limited resources and Union personnel to protect. Seal the bunkers." She had nodded, said nothing, and then quietly requisitioned materials she technically had no authorization to take. The final panel locked into place with a satisfying thunk. Mira activated the energy shield, and immediately the howling wind became a muffled roar. She stumbled inside, her legs shaking from exhaustion and cold, and collapsed against the wall near the entrance gate. 17 cubs stared at her. Then slowly they began to approach. Saren came first, his small body trembling as he crossed the few meters between them. His light patterns had changed, curiosity mixed with something that looked almost like reverence. He pressed his head against her gloved hand, and a warm pulsing glow spread from his fur. The other cubs followed, piling around her in a heap of silver and light, their combined bioluminescence turning the shelter into a constellation. For the first time in 3 days, Mira allowed herself to smile. The storm raged for another 47 hours. Inside the shelter, Mira rationed the protein packs she'd brought, sharing them equally with the cubs despite their protests. She told them stories, not that they could understand her words, but they seemed to appreciate the rhythm of her voice. She showed them pictures on her datapad of Earth, of forests and oceans, of other animals her people had learned to protect. Saren rarely left her side. When she slept, he curled against her shoulder. When she checked the shields, he followed her like a shadow. The other cubs began to mimic him, and soon Mira found herself the center of a furry, glowing solar system. On the 3rd day, the wind stopped. Mira opened the shelter gate cautiously, expecting destruction. Instead, she found clarity. The storm had scoured the landscape clean, and the twin suns of the system cast everything in sharp, beautiful relief. She also found that she wasn't alone. The adult Linari had returned. 24 of them stood in a semicircle around the shelter, their larger bodies rigid with what Mira's xenobiology training recognized as shock. They had expected to find bones and scattered remains. Instead, they found their cubs alive, healthy, and clustered around a human who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. The largest Linari, a female with scars across her shoulders, approached slowly. Her light patterns were complex, cycling through colors Mira had never seen before. The cubs responded, their own lights creating a conversation Mira couldn't fully understand. But she understood enough. Saren broke away from the group and moved to Mira's side. He looked at his mother, then back at Mira, then deliberately laid down at the entrance of the shelter gate. The other cubs followed suit, creating a living barrier between Mira and the adults. The message was clear. She protected us. Now we protect her. The adult Linari were silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, they too began to settle around the shelter. The scarred female was the last, and she positioned herself directly beside Saren, her eyes never leaving Mira's face. When Commander Vexthor's security team finally located Mira, 12 hours later, they found a scene that would be recorded in xenoanthropology databases across the Union for decades to come. A human sleeping peacefully against a shelter gate, surrounded by an entire Linari pack that refused to let anyone approach without her permission. Explain yourself, Vexthor demanded, his mandibles clicking with irritation. You violated direct orders, misappropriated equipment, and risked your life for non-union entities. Mira, still half asleep and covered in silver fur, looked up at him with eyes that held no apology. They were children, she said simply. What else was I supposed to do? The commander had no answer for that. But Saren, curled beside the gate with his mother's tail wrapped protectively around him, pulsed a single steady light pattern that the Union's translators would later identify as the Linari word for family. And in the quiet aftermath of the storm, surrounded by the beings she'd saved and the beings who now claimed her as their own, Mira Dawn understood that humanity's greatest strength had never been its technology or its weapons. It was knowing that some things, compassion, protection, the refusal to abandon the helpless, transcended species, logic, and even survival itself. That was what made them human. And perhaps in this vast and often cruel universe, that was what made them extraordinary.